Okay, this is Edwin Blosser, and welcoming everyone on the call. On this particular teleclass call, we are talking about three main types of compost qualities that we work with. Now, in the industry, there's 6 different types, but more specifically and very clearly, I want to talk about 3 types. First of all, we work with these 3 types all the time. We highly recommend to consider these 3 types because it fits the category of almost everyone out there. And with this topic of being on the call, you have shown your interest in what this could potentially do. And so from a standpoint of making compost, every bit of compost ends up where? It ends up in the soil. Now we know, and we have a lot of customers that are in this category with no negative statement at all. They're interested in making something no longer bad, just be comfortable and good enough to put on the soil, and we're okay with that. By definition, this call is the 3 different qualities of compost. The first quality of compost, number 1, is what we call regular compost. It's about how much nutrient is in it. It's better than raw manure, but it has some similar characteristics. What am I saying? I'm saying it has similar characteristics in this aspect as we look at the NPK, the sulfur, the calcium, and some of the other nutrients as a way to establish the value of this product. In other words, it's a product that's made into compost, and compost is what we would call regular, good quality compost, is basically a compost that is decomposed to a compost-like substance. Now, I need to digress with this first group of compost I'm going to talk about in a moment. I'll go back to it, but I want to just clearly line out the 3. So, first of all, the first group is regular compost. The second one is what we call supercharged compost. And the third one is humus compost. At a workshop next week, we will be looking at those more specifically. But I would like to communicate to you that we are talking about 3 different types of compost that we highly recommend. So the first one is nutrient. And good compost has got some nutrients in it that are beneficial. And then the second group is supercharged, and we'll talk about what does it mean by being supercharged. Now all of a sudden it's not so important and needful to just have nutrients in it, but it's what those nutrients actually end up doing when it hits the soil. Supercharged goes further than just straight nutrient compost. Supercharge is simply going to go much further and having a much longer term impact. Also, Supercharge ends up becoming more available sooner and actually lasts into some more years in the future of also providing benefits. Then the third group is called Humus Compost. Humus Compost is truly sun energy that's captured into a protein and given back to your soil and roots of your plants. And now humus compost has much higher availability, a much sooner utilization, but it also is much longer lasting. We now know that 5 and 6 years after application, you still benefit from this compost application this year. Or let's say it differently. If you had been applying humus compost back in 2017, you would be in your 6th year benefiting greatly of what you put on in 17. If you was putting it on every year, then you would be still gaining benefit from your 17 application, your 18 application, your 2019 application, 2020 and 21. That's what I call stacking the odds in your favor. So again, 3 groups, summarizing one last time: regular compost, the supercharged compost, and the humus compost. So now let me go swing back to the regular compost. I'm going to talk about this a little bit. In the regular compost, we're concerned about what it contains. because that's what we're going to get. The value is in what it does contain, not necessarily what it does do functionally in the soil, but what it contains. Now, true, that does have a function of something that contains some nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium and calcium. Functionally, that will do something. I'm not trying to negate that at all, but you're simply looking at regular compost as being what we would call good, beneficial to the soil, beneficial to the crops, but it is in a lot of ways not nearly as long impacting, nor does it give as much energy to the crop as the other two groups are. So as I talk about and back up about compost, in the big world of composting, as I have been making compost since 1992, on June 2nd marked the 30th anniversary to the day, I believe, it was to the day, plus or minus a day or so, of when I started making my first compost. And so it's an interesting journey for the last 30 years. I have been able to watch many different composting operations. I'm saying hundreds. Now, it could be almost over 1,000, but I'll just say hundreds for right now. And in this aspect, I have seen many different things happen. For example, in the industry today, if you have any type of organic matter, it could be raw manure, or it could be old hay, or it could be anything that you use in the compost windrow, whether it's leaves or shrubbery ground up, wood ground up, or I'll just call it elephant doo-doo, or yard waste of any kind, or chocolate-covered cherries, which we've been involved in many, many hundreds of different things. If it used to grow, it is able to compost. But in the industry, compost is a very broad term. In the industry, it is a broad term. By definition, legally, you can call something compost when it has decayed about 5% from original. Let's say you get a pile of leaves or a pile of organic matter, you put it on the windrow, it gets to be decomposed about 5% of it. Still 95% of the material, the plant material, is intact, but it can legally be called compost. And so compost has a broad variety of things, and everybody says and uses the same word. When we say regular, good, nutrient compost, it ends up looking like soil, and you can barely see what it originally came from. That's what we talk about compost. And that type of the Group 1 compost, it's important to know, where did the compost come from? Is this dairy manure compost? Is this leaf compost? Is this landscaping compost? Is this hog manure compost? Is this chicken manure compost, turkey manure compost, etc.? Those are all valid questions in the first group. Not so much in the second group, and definitely not in the third group, because we're now more concerned about the function of what it does in the soil than actually where it came from. And by the way, whether it is in Australia, where they're making humus compost, or whether it is in South America or in any parts of the U.S. or across the pond to the east of the U.S. into Europe and Asia, the humus compost all ends up the same. Doesn't matter what we start with, the latter part of the cycle is always the same. So in the first group, it's important to ask, what does it come from? In the last group, it's important to ask, what was the process like, and can I see the windrow readings? All right? So now again, back to Group 1, that is regular compost. It looks like soil. It has some N, P, and K in it. We like to have something in the order of anywhere from 10 pounds to 30 pounds of nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium, and up to that much of calcium, probably a little less of that of sulfur, and some trace elements, and that's what we are talking about in Group 1. Group 1 compost, that is regular compost, those things happen a lot. There are millions of tons of this product made. Now, granted, it's a variable. Some of it is good, some of it is not. One thing I want to put a caution on Group 1 is if it is allowed to go without oxygen and rot or decompose without oxygen, it's not as good as if you keep it with oxygen. Why? Well, the roots in the soil, they want stuff that's aerobic or stuff that rotted with oxygen or air. They want that stuff. They don't like organic matter that went putrid and sour as it was rotting or decomposing. That actually ends up burning root tips. And so when we talk about group 1, we're talking about beneficial compost, nutrient compost, and we have many, many customers making this good product, and it is certainly not something negative. So now we're going to advance into group 2. This is called Supercharged Compost. Supercharged Compost is something that is really supercharged for one specific reason. Number one, it rots just like group 1. You want it to get to looking like soil. It rots. But there's something unique about group 2 and 3 that's different than 1. We pay a lot of attention to capturing things so they do not evaporate out of that organic matter that's decaying. Why is that? We have learned that anything that grows, and I'm even talking about the manure coming out of the back of an animal. It used to be feedstuffs that the animal ate, and therefore then it was made into manure going through the stomach of the animal, whether it's hogs, chicken, or cattle. Any of those kinds of things, that manure came from organic matter. How come? It's because the organic matter that was grown to make the feed, which is what the animals ate, that feed was all organic matter. So when it's manure, it's been partially digested, but it's still what we would call in the raw state of organic matter. So anything, whether it's leaves or whether it's shrubs or grass clippings or anything that grew, once it starts decomposing, there's one unique thing that happens to all organic matter. In order for that to grow in the beginning, when it was growing on the stalk of the plant before the feed was harvested, I don't care whether it's actually a forage or whether it's corn or corn silage or whether it's oatlage or oats or any of those kinds of things, this is all organic matter that we know grew with the sun and the atmospheric gases and energy, etc. And every bit of that part above ground that went into growing this plant was lighter than air. Think about it. Are light beams lighter than air? Amen. That's where the photosynthesis comes from, and so on and so forth. So most of the stuff of the mass that grew came from the sun and the atmospheric energy and the atmospheric gases. Now, there's a little bit coming from the soil, but I have to explain a story to give you my point. There's a physician that did a study several hundred years ago where he put together a pot, exactly 200 pounds of soil, planted a 5-pound tree in that pot, watered it for 5 years, did not give it any fertilizer, but just for water, and that tree grew in that pot. Now it grew up in 5 years' time to 164 pounds. So this 5-pound tree became 164 pounds heavy once it got up to 5 years. How do I know that? Well, at the end of 5 years, they carefully took this tree out of that exact 200 pounds worth of soil, cleaned the soil off of the roots, made sure the roots were out of the pot, and guess what? Because that tree was now weighing 164 pounds, it started out at 5 pounds, it had made a gain in 5 years of 159 pounds. 159 pounds. Yet the soil still weighed 199 pounds and 14 ounces. That means that we got 159 pounds of growth and only 2 ounces came from the soil. Remember, there's no fertilizer getting on here. There's no fertilizer put in here. It's just water. And so 2 ounces came from the soil, and 159 pounds, which is 2,544 ounces, most of that came, all but 2 of that 2,544 ounces came from the atmospheric air, sun, atmospheric gases, etc., and most of that is lighter than air. What do I mean by lighter than air? Just as helium in a helium gas balloon, it's going to go where? Up in the air like a helium gas balloon. And so if you look at this, a hot air balloon, etc., realize that some hot air balloons are just hot air, but I'm saying a helium-filled gas balloon, it wants to go up because it's lighter than air, therefore it's going to go up where it's lighter up there. And that's exactly what happens in most compost operations that most composters do not get. They lose an awful lot of the sun energy, not nutrients necessarily, but of the sun energy. They lose it up in the air. And what we want to do is supercharge every bit of the nutrients in the compost, supercharge it. And the way we do that is we retain the nutrients and we combine it with the sun energy that we got captured. We have several ways to capture it. I will not talk much on how to do that simply because of not having enough time. But essentially, we put in a microbial substance that puts out an enzyme whenever it touches decaying organic matter, and that actually grabs onto and does not allow evaporation to happen. That means we're capturing it. Plus, we would put a little bit of clay soil in there. Not a lot by volume, but 3 or 4% of clay in there as well. So now in the end of 5 to 7 or 8 weeks, we have supercharged compost. We have captured the stuff. We've not necessarily advanced to stage 3, but we have got it way beyond regular compost. And I did forget to say regular compost, the time frame varies a lot, but we would highly recommend everybody that uses our equipment, composting equipment, they would use a water tank behind the turner. You know, you can't rot a hay bale in the hay mow. And I know this is farmer language, but you don't get stuff to rot inside. You have to get it outside where it rains, if you live in an area that rains, that is. But if something gets wet, then it rots. That's the point I'm making. So why would you not have water with your compost turner when you're making compost? You got to have it wet so it rots. And so when we take group number 1, we do about 5 to 7 weeks in group number 1, sometimes up to 10, but most of the time between 5 and 7 weeks it takes to process regular group 1 compost, regular compost, nutrient compost. Same goes for supercharged. Doesn't take any longer. It's basically the same time. Now, if we go into group 3, that takes about 10 to 12 weeks. It takes a little bit longer. But we're doing a lot more than rotting. In the group 3 product, we're spending more time in capturing and incorporating that volatile compound into a protein. In the second group, the supercharged product, we do not incorporate that into a protein. But once we get to group 3, we do just like we do in 2, but then we go further, and we take that stuff we captured and allow microbes to eat on it and to group it together, aggregate it together. That means taking many pieces and making one piece out of it called a protein. We call that humus protein. How? By taking the sun energy and putting it into a protein form. Now that's why that the humus compost is worth 10 times the value of group 1 or regular compost. Regardless of the nutrient content, it is worth a lot more. Why? Well, let me give you an example. In the third group, you are able to take advantage of atmospheric nitrogen. Atmospheric nitrogen, as most of us know, or some of us know, is 78% atmospheric nitrogen of the air that we breathe. You and I take for granted that we're here and we can breathe and we love breathing. As you stop and think, that's something that's really a gift and so on. But everything that is in the air, above the earth, as you breathe and work in the earth, you are taking in 78% atmospheric nitrogen. Everybody knows that, but why can't we take that nitrogen and put it into the soil? Well, we can if we got proteins to work with, and we have a home base called Humus Protein Home Base for microbes that love capturing nitrogen out of the air. They thrive in this protein source. So they get and take nitrogen out of the air and put it in the soil. So would you rather have something that gives you nitrogen and then it's over with, or would you like to have something that continually brings more nitrogen even next year and the following year up to 6 years from now for what you applied this year? And so that's kind of the difference between the three groups: the regular compost, the supercharged, which is just simply focused on capturing stuff, and then the third group called Humus Compost, which is capturing it and converting it over to a protein. So those are the three different groups of compost that we're talking about, and this is the aspect that's so fun to talk about. Almost every large compost operation needs to do some of all three. They choose that way, and they should economically choose that way. For the people that are smaller in operations, most of those want to either produce the number 2 or number 3 group. Why? Because obviously that's the value add side, right? You get a lot more value per ton, a lot more. And who doesn't want to put on 1 ton that does the same thing as 10 ton of the first group? A lot less compaction, a lot less freight. Freight's a big deal, and a whole lot more effectiveness, and year after year accumulating in value. Let's say that you in 2017 applied the third group. In 2018 you did it again, and so on every year. It's synergy. It adds on what you've done previously, and it actually starts really rolling back in. We've had wet, sticky clay soils, for example, in the second and third year become very nicely aggregated in spite of the tremendous amount of rain still staying aggregated in tilthy soils and so on. This is the visual stuff. This is the marvelous things that you can do when you have this humus protein. And so, again, in summary, I appreciate that everyone has been on this call to talk about the 3 different types of compost that we work with. I want to remind everyone that in the industry we have categorized 6 different groups. We have done so based on what we encounter. That doesn't mean that's what we recommend. Out of the 6, we only recommend 3 of those. But it's something that I would like to further. Any questions here coming up or any thoughts you would like to share? We'll have that on here. And the other thing is, please do not forget, we do have a workshop coming up. We are almost full. We had 5 spots left, and one of those was just taken a little bit ago, 1 or 2 of those actually, now that I think about it. And so it's fast getting to be completely full. I don't mind if you wait until the following workshop or whatever, but still, in the end, when we look at what we're representing, we represent opportunity with compost that very few people do. How come? Well, we have predictable end results. For one, that means that if somebody uses your product, they come back and they want to do it again, and that repeats itself, etc. And secondly, we take organic matter to the highest practical value of what you got. That means that people that have livestock, for example, can end up making compost bring them also value, getting them a lot more value out of their manure. But guess what? One last thing, and this often blows people over, you don't have to have any manure to get into composting. Every year we make some rows that we don't put any manure in it. In fact, we do somewhere around 1,000 cubic yards of non-manure compost every year. We do it for a lot of reasons, but one of them is to prove that it does not require manure. I suspect that on a typical call that we get in a teleclass, most of those would be very surprised to hear me say, and by the way, if you have manure, that's great. If you don't, that's fine. It's not necessary to make good compost. We have customers that have 0 amount of manure and have been making compost for 10 plus years. And so it is not required to have manure to make this happen, but it is also a very nice thing or neat thing if you do have it. It's either way. So with that, Kelly, I'd like to turn it back to you and open this thing up for a potential several questions before we shut this down.
Okay. All right. I'm going to unmute everybody, but you will still need to press *1 if you want to ask a question. So give me just a second here. Okay, if there are any questions out there, if you will press *1, and then you can ask your question. I thought this was a really good call. You know, I've been listening to Edwin for 22 years now, and I always seem to learn something, and again today I did.
Well, thank you, Kelly. I'm not sure if we're getting anyone with a call, and that's a question, and that's okay. We
right.
will need to be shutting that down, but just so they know, again, they need to press *1 if they do want to. So again,
Kelly, Eric Nelson here. I've got a question.
Okay,
sure,
go ahead.
Sure.
What's the shelf life, so to say, of a humus compost? Is there a need to get it spread right away, or how long can a person let it sit there before it could be spread?
Okay, that's an excellent question. I'm very thankful for it. We typically try to make sure that by the second year we get it applied. So 12 to 24 months is the answer you're looking for.
Okay, I didn't figure it'd be that long, but that gives you plenty of time to do something with it then.
Correct, that's right.
Does it degrade?
Like, for example, we will be making product this summer that will end up probably finally shipping out in the next fall. So we want always to have product in the spring, throughout the summer, into the fall, and then we just keep product ahead, keep producing every year. Now, I'm not suggesting to you that we have enough for this entire fall. We don't, but we'll end up, in some years we end up selling out sooner. This is one of those years. We only have about 100 ton, so we have very little getting into fall right now. But that's, yes, 1 to 2 years is when I want to have it moved for sure.
So once it's finished, it's pretty stable then. It doesn't lose any of the
Yes, it is. I would like to specify this, Eric, that once it is finished, once a month during the season, we will be giving it a drink and keeping it under cover. That is one thing I did not specify, and not intentionally, but did not have time to get into the details. But we cover. That's one thing that we do with Group 2 and Group 3, and we do this with the function of maintaining the right moisture. So we cover our rows with a breathable fabric, not plastic, but a fabric that we put chain on the side because we get lots of wind we get gusts here that get pretty vicious. They can get up to 80 mile an hour or whatever, and it's very seldom that way, but generally speaking, something that's 50 mile an hour or less, we have no problems, but I admit to you that there's that freak storm that occasionally will get something. But nonetheless, we keep it covered. We like to have it moist and stay moist. That's how you can keep your organisms alive. That's how you keep your function going well. And it's all about function, if you caught that. Does that help, Eric?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
You are very welcome. Appreciate that question. I'll take one last question, and then we'll shut down. Okay, well, that's okay. I don't mind. We have a hard stop period at this point. Guys, I really appreciate you guys joining. Oh, you have a question? Go ahead.
Yeah, Edwin, this is Robert Brown with Bricko Farms in Augusta, Georgia.
Okay.
When you're composting your windrows, do you cover them up after you turn them?
Yes. We have a mechanical roller put onto a skid steer, and we go along and we roll it up, we turn it, and we roll it back on. We have found that the hay bale doesn't rot unless it's out of the hay mow. So it does the windrow. It doesn't rot if you let it dry out. So we keep it covered. It does breathe, but it still retains moisture inside. The other thing is I remember in my first year, that's 30 years ago, this summer, in the later part of the summer, I was making compost, and one day during the night we had 9.5 inches of rain in 10 hours. And about 15 feet of my compost windrow, the fabric blew off. The others stayed covered. Now you get this. I was selling this product at that time, which we're doing a lot higher now, Today we're selling it for $220 a ton. But at those days I was selling it for 115 to 120 bucks a ton on the Group 3. And we were moving that product. Well, in that night where the fabric blew off, it got complete mud. So now what's its value? Well, I used it to make more products, but if I'd have gotten $10 or $15 a ton for that product, I would have been lucky. It was just pure mud. So it wasn't going to do me any good to do that. I brought it back into a new batch of windrow and I used it again. But I give you that example. We've had this happen many different times when a storm event comes up. And when you make this kind of humus protein, it sucks up water, right? It's like a sponge. Well, you can get too much water in there. And once you get to be mud, it doesn't give you a whole lot of value to the function of it. So you don't want to keep it. You want to keep protecting your assets. And so yes, we would strongly encourage using fabric, and we have made it mechanized so that we can make it easier to work with and make it very efficient. Does that help?
Cool beans. Yes, sir, it does.
All right. All right, folks, it's been a wonderful time with you. Thank you for joining on the call. Everyone has their valued time. I do appreciate you coming. Thank you for allowing us. And if there's any questions that you still would have to ask, please call our office at 815-438-7200. We would be happy to accommodate any new questions, anything that comes up. And again, I remind you, there's a workshop coming up where you're going to hear 3 days of more detail. Coming up next week, there'll be some more classes later this year as well. So you all have a wonderful afternoon. God bless. Thank you. Bye.